Hello, my friends. I'm tired because of these modern werewolves with glasses. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. The October days drifted by in Joseph's small town as the temperature dropped and the crisp air whispered warnings to prepare for winter. The farmers living in the countryside surrounding the town were bringing in the last of their crops' bounty to be sold and traded for the necessities everyone needed to make it through the cold months. Joseph stood on the front step of Goody Foods with a broom which was much too tall for him. He was taking a break from sweeping and staring out at the town's main intersection. He watched as people hurried across the street, walking this way and that, holding their coats closed against the especially cold afternoon. He thought this town seemed average if you didn't look too long. People were running their errands or serving food at the diner or walking their dogs like anywhere else, he supposed. But when he really looked at their faces for more than a moment, he could see the tension. He saw a concealed fear that made his stomach drop about 3 floors. "Joe, I am not paying you to stand around gawking at people, am I? The shopkeeper, Mr. Walker, said from behind the cash register. "No sir, I am sorry, Joseph said, looking back inside at the old man. "Goddamn charity I am running here, grumbled Mr. Walker as he limped to the storeroom. Joseph swept the rest of the step and turned back to go into the store to stock cans when he caught sight of a young woman walking across the intersection towards him. She was taller than most of the women he had seen in the town and thin in a way that would look awkward on someone without her posture. She looked delicate, but not fragile. There was something about the way she walked that was elegant. It was like a big cat he had seen on TV, every muscle flexing and shifting under a silken coat of fur. Her hair was plain, a color that looked like maybe it was blonde once and had aged into a nondescript mousy brown. Her eyes were the color of a lake in winter, gray and cold and dangerous. He thought she was beautiful. People moved out of her way in every direction. A couple walking a good block away heading for the intersection turned and hustled in the opposite direction. Cars stopped despite their turn to cross. A dog gave one brave yip in her direction and then scuttled away from her with its tail between its legs, dragging its owner with him. From above, the scene might have looked like an invisible bomb had dropped in the center of town, sending a wave of destruction in all directions, clearing out any sign of life within range of that deadly explosion. At that same moment, Mrs. Ellis, a woman Joseph barely recognized, but who was obviously one of the well-to-do women in the town, walked by the storefront where he was standing. She looked at him sideways and curled her lip. "Disgusting filth," she mumbled as she passed in front of him. Then she spat on his shoe. Joseph didn't even know proper ladies knew how to spit. What was so awful about him that this woman would do such a thing? Somehow, during that brief encounter, the fearsome young woman that Joseph had been watching had made it to the storefront. She appeared on the sidewalk directly in front of Mrs. Ellis. Mrs. Ellis, her eyes still locked on Joseph, ran directly into her. She bounced back a step and looked up at Anna, who was nearly a foot taller than her. Anna stared at her with a look so devoid of emotion that it was impossible to tell if she could see the woman at all. Mrs. Ellis seemed frozen in place in her presence. Anna's grey eyes flicked into focus and looked into Mrs. Ellis' eyes for a fraction of a second, and the woman immediately dropped her eyes and shook her head once like she was trying to clear her vision after staring at the sun. A small whimper leaked from her lips and then she jolted away in the opposite direction as if pushed. She walked down the street so fast, she knocked the mailman's satchel off his shoulder, spraying mail all over the sidewalk. The mailman looked at Mrs. Ellis with a burning hatred for only a moment until he, too, saw Anna. One glance at the young woman melted the rage off his face and turned him into a drooling child. He took off, slack-jawed, in the same direction as Mrs. Ellis, letters and postcards spraying out in his wake. Joseph was confused. The woman before him was indeed intimidating, but he had never seen such a reaction from the people in his town before. He looked back at her, tilting his head up to see her face. She was standing there looking down at him, with a slightly puzzled expression. Her eyes seemed bluer than grey up close, and they were more lovely than frightening. "Hi, he said dumbly. She, almost imperceivably, seemed to recoil away from him, like he was a rodent in her kitchen. Then her eyes hardened into the slate grey of the winter sky. She stepped around him into the store. Joseph turned slowly and watched her pick up a package that was waiting for her on the counter. Mr. Walker was nowhere to be found. She laid down some cash, put the bundle under her arm and walked right back out, breezing past Joseph on her way down the steps. She continued down the sidewalk, onto her next errand. Joseph walked a few paces after her and then just stopped and watched her go. When she crossed the street at the next block, she briefly turned her head in his direction and he swore he could see an eye analyzing him behind a curtain of hair. When Joseph had exhausted every shopkeeper in town with his pleas for work, he gathered up his grand total of $5 and headed back to his bunker. It was almost 5 o'clock and he intended on at least letting his mother know that he was alive before sneaking out of the trailer again. Maybe she would even have some dinner for him. Crazier things have happened. Joseph took the long way through the woods so that he could stop at the bunker and grab his books. He wanted to have some reading material in case his mother really put the lockdown on. Sometimes, she would feign the strict mother role and try to ground him for a night and even make him go to school the next day. It was usually when she had no more booze or money left and needed to take out her frustration on someone. It was almost nice in a way. At least she was a little bit more present then, and seeing her sober, even if it was just for a night, and even if it made her unbearably miserable, was a sign that she hadn't completely faded away. She was still his mother. As Joseph approached the bunker door, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck start to rise. There was a light on inside and he could see someone moving around in there. Alan was the only one who knew about his bunker and he never came into town this late. What if it was some vagrant trying to set up camp in there? He approached slowly and kept his distance. "Hello? Who's in there?" Joseph said with his best impression of a tough guy's voice. He grabbed up a big stick near his feet and held it out in front of him with both hands. The light in the cabin flickered as a body passed by it and turned the latch on the inside of the door. His bladder suddenly seemed very full and it seemed his flight response was about to beat the fighting side. "You know what? Forget it. It's yours, man!" Joseph screeched. He turned to run and tripped over his own useless weapon. He fell with a thud and started scrambling to his feet, breathing harshly and scraping the ground with his nails as the bunker door opened and feet crunched through leaves towards him. "Help!" Joseph yelled helplessly. Hey kid. Calm down! A familiar voice behind him said. Joseph whipped around onto his back and tried to hold the stick in front of him. The stick, now broken, one end hanging limply, was shaking towards Alan. Alan laughed heartily, slapping his knees and wiping his eyes at the sight. "Jesus kid, you are really high-strung, you know that, he said. "You scared the crap out of me, Alan. What are you doing here so late? I thought for sure I was dead, Joseph said, taking Alan's outreached hand and letting him pull him up to his feet. "I know. I should have told you, kiddo. I made a special trip tonight to talk to you about something. I brought some dinner too, Alan said. Joseph could smell greasy burgers and fries drifting through the bunker door, and he suddenly couldn't remember the last time he ate. He was starving, and the prospect of his mother had anything to eat in the trailer was far-fetched. Okay. That sounds good, I guess. I probably need to go home after though, Joseph said. Of course. I'll walk you home so the monsters don't get you, he said with a grin and a flicker of mischief in his eyes. Joseph followed Alan into the bunker and found that Alan had tidied it up. The lantern was burning bright and there were colorful, new cushions and blankets neatly stacked around the small space, transforming the room into a decadent Moroccan lounge in Joseph's soaring imagination. Holy shit. This is. Joseph started. Too much? Alan said, grimacing and holding his head with one hand. He started to pull on his hair a little, an anxious tick Joseph had never noticed before. I knew it was a risk moving your private stuff around like this, but I wanted it to be special. I wanted tonight to be special. I wanted to do something nice for my friend. I am sorry. I am sorry, he said as he hit his temple with the palm of his hand repeatedly. It looked like it hurt. He seemed on the brink of tears. Don't, Alan. Stop it. It's great. It's really great. It's probably the nicest looking place I've ever been in. It's definitely better than that shithole trailer, Joseph said. He was worried about Alan but also blown away by his kindness. No one had ever been as kind to him as Alan. Alan shuffled over to one of the walls, shaking his head. He stood with his back to Joseph and stared at the wolf picture on the wall. He was silent and still for what seemed like ages. Alan? It's really alright. Thank you for this. He looked over at the greasy, paper bags of food in the center of the room. Should we sit and eat? I don't know about you, but I am starving, Joseph said. Slowly, Alan turned around and his grin was back. He looked like himself, not that that was always a comforting sight. I am sorry about that, Joey. I've just had a really rough few days and I guess I am just all wound up. Get those burgers out and let us eat, Alan said, plopping down onto one of the oversized cushions on the ground. Joseph smiled and happily dug into his food. At that moment, Anna was on her way home and felt an enormous weight drop from her shoulders as she stepped off the main road from town and into the woods. She still had 3 miles of wilderness to walk through before reaching her farm, but she didn't mind that. Their woods were comforting. They made sense to her. She always took a new path when she took her walks. She was beginning to know every corner of this forest, and that knowledge made her an increasingly adept hunter. With her yearly visit to town behind her, she could get on with her preparation for the winter. She hated going into town. She had a tough time seeing those people as people anymore. They seemed more like rodents scurrying around aimlessly. Things were different now than they were when her father was alive. He knew how to blend with normal people and seemed, at times, even to like it. For Anna, it was different. She had inherited her father's responsibilities and she executed them with precision every year, but when her father was in charge, there was anonymity to his status in the town. Only the eldest members of the town knew what was required of Anna and her family, and they cooperated. Since Anna had been on her own, their fear of her, rather than respect, had spread through the town like wildfire. Once she turned of age, her father had trained her vigorously. Even as he grew ill, he would take her into the woods and teach her how to survive, how to hunt and how to harvest for the town. She excelled at almost everything except for managing her emotions. On her first hunt by herself, she tracked a deer into a clearing near Ferry-Manespond. She had learned how to control herself to some degree during the time of transformation, during the harvest time, but she had slip-ups. She looked down at the clearing from the sky above and swooped down towards the deer with talons drawn. Suddenly, a shot rang out and the deer dropped to the ground. Anna swooped down and landed on the deer, head swiveling in all directions looking for the culprit of the sound. A man was standing on the edge of the clearing in hunting gear, his shotgun hanging limply at his side as he stared at her with eyes clamoring to escape from his skull. He made a strange sputtering sound like a car trying to start as he looked at the enormous beast perched on his deer. Anna looked back at him, eyes also wide and unsure. She had never encountered a human in her hunting form before. The man finally shuddered to life and clumsily raised the shotgun up and pointed it at her. She tried to remember her training and calm him down. "Wait, she said. "I won't hurt you." Her voice rang softly like church bells. The man seemed dazed for a moment as she folded her wings against her body and spread her human arms out in a peaceful gesture. She started to hum softly, a soft lilting tune that made the man's mouth droop down into a mystified O shape. She took one step off the deer carcass towards him, her long hair moving gently in the breeze. The man's eyes started to grow heavy and he felt the fear start to drain out of him. He looked at the beautiful creature standing before him. He looked at her soft blue eyes, and her fair skin, glistening in the waning sunlight. She was naked and glorious. Her hypnotic song distracted him from the 3-inch, needle-sharp teeth that made up her murderous smile. The man sank to his knees, ready to worship, his gun beginning to move off its target. His eyes slid down to her legs and he saw the strange angle of her knees. His eyes widened once again as he took in the unnatural bend of her legs that ended in sharp, 3-toed hawk talons. One sharp talon, as big as a scythe, was sinking into the deer's hide, leaking blood onto the grass below. He gasped like a half-drowned man coming back to life and his finger instinctively squeezed the gun's trigger. A bullet whizzed by one of Anna's wings, missing by no more than 3 inches. Rage filled Anna's brain and she raised her giant hawk wings and shot up into the air. She bellowed with a voice like a thunder crack. The man started to run for the woods, but only got a few feet before she descended on him, pinning him to the ground with one powerful leg. She raised the other above his head, preparing to rip his face from his skull. He wept and begged for mercy, and as she looked into his eyes, her human consciousness whispered to her from some small, locked room in her heart. She pitied the man and hated that he looked at her with such horror. It was the first time anyone other than her mother and father had seen her that way. She threw her head back and shrieked into the sky while every part of her longed to be put out of her misery. Instead of taking his life, she shot up into the air, flying higher and higher into the black sky. After the shock wore off a bit, the hunter stumbled to his feet and started running towards town. He screamed and yelled for help, and the townspeople peeked through their curtains, watching the madman run. He finally made it to the church steps and collapsed the screaming. Someone help me? There are demons in the woods. They're coming for us. She is coming for us all. He screamed into the air. The church door opened, and the pastor stepped out in his bedclothes. He stooped down and helped the raving man to his feet. Come in and tell me what you saw. The man followed him inside. Anna flew through the sky that night until she was too exhausted to go on. With the last of her strength, She rode the wind back to the farmhouse and landed near the pigsty. The pigs squealed and moved away from the side of the fence where she was standing. "Did you stop him?" Her father's voice floated out through the darkened screen door. She could see his eyes glowing faintly from inside the house. Anna shook her head violently, trying to turn back, but the adrenaline coursing through her wouldn't he allow it. "Stop it, Anna," he said. The screen door opened, and Jaeth's towering form appeared on the porch. At first, half of his head emerged from the darkness with one burning eye looking through her. Then his whole face appeared, pitted with shadowy craters cast by the moonlight. He looked like a haggard wolf in farmeress clothes. Anna knelt before him. Her wings flicked out and back in as she struggled to lay her head against the dirt road. Her hands covered her face as she wept. Her naked torso was covered with dirt and blood. She twisted and turned until she was bowed before him, wings tucked tight against her back and her backward knees bent beneath her. Jaeth looked at his daughter in silence as she laid there before him like a wounded animal. "I love you more than I can say. I wish this fate was not yours to carry. What you have done today has put our lives, as well as the lives of everyone in that town, in danger. Do you understand?" He said in a disturbingly calm tone. "Only the chosen may see you, for their tongues are soon extinguished." That hunter should have been silenced before he reached the town. Anna felt her body start to tingle, and then burn and tear apart. She was turning back, a sensation she supposed was worse than burning alive. Her wings flexed and retreated slowly into her shoulder blades. The scales shed from her legs as soft, vulnerable, human flesh returned. Her body convulsed up and down for a moment, while her legs straightened and then folded at human knees and human angles. She lay there shivering, looking like a little girl again. She stayed bowed before him, not daring to look up. "I can't do this, she said finally. "You have no choice, he said. And she could hear the misery in his voice. She stayed there until she heard his retreating footsteps and the squeal of the screen door open and close. Her father was all she had. His disappointment was unbearable. On her father's dying day, a day that had left her unable to fathom attachment to any creature, human or otherwise, ever again, she held her father's hand while he slept. He was breathing unevenly and with great struggle. She looked at his sunken cheeks and sallow skin and willed him to open his eyes one last time. Years had passed since her mother took her own life with a rope in the bedroom closet. Anna knew her mother hadn't been able to cope with the idea of her daughter being a monster too. Her mother disconnected from her as soon as the training began. This was about a year after Anna first discovered what her father did during harvest time every year. She knew her mother loved her and her father very much. She loved her father enough to stand by him all those years, even after knowing what he was. However, the thought of her own little girl carrying out the deeds of hell destroyed her. Her mother's death left a part of Anna empty, and a bigger part hating herself for all eternity. Her father, Jaeth, lay there dying on the bed he had shared with his wife for 20 years before her death. The doctor in town had determined that Jaeth's ailment was some form of cancer, although he had never seen anything like it before. His body had been slowly wasting away since Anna turned 13. It seemed that as Anna grew older and stronger, Jaeth grew weaker and closer to death.